Hello, my name is Adnan Mahmutovic, and this is Love and Its Discontents podcast. We are really pleased that we have today with us Dr. Lisa Ann Robertson, who is an associate professor in 19th-century British literature with expertise in Romanticism and 18th-century literature and culture at Department of English, University of South Dakota. Lisa Ann, thank you so much for joining Love and Its Discontents to speak about Jane Eyre.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm very excited to talk about Jane Eyre and love, I think, and its discontents. So yeah, thank you for the invitation.
Pleasure. I was thinking we could start with really briefly to summarize the novel. Just tell us, what's it about, and then maybe say something about how it is a tale of love. What is love in this story?
Sure. So Jane Eyre is the story of an orphan girl who is living in an abusive situation with her foster family or step family or whatever that family is. And she's a very passionate, sort of rebellious, wild girl. And because of her inability to not speak her mind, she ends up getting sent to sort of a religious boarding school for indigent and wayward girls, where she ostensibly learns to sort of control her passions and to keep her temper in check and to learn humility, et cetera, et cetera. Upon reaching, young adulthood, she becomes a governess, and so she moves to, this Gothic mansion on the moors where she takes care of what we later find out is the illegitimate child of a sort of dark and brooding and handsome Byronic hero, Rochester. And, it starts out with him not being there. He returns and their relationship develops. I'm really condensing this, but they end up engaged and they're going to get married. Well, before they get married, it turns out he has a mad wife locked up in the attic. So, Jane then runs away. So she, strikes out on her own across the moors, where she serendipitously finds her family, her real family, which consists of two young women and a young man, St. John Rivers, who is a very moralistic, fire and brimstone kind of religious type who wants Jane to enter into a loveless marriage with him so that they can go fulfill their duty by being missionaries in Africa. She has to sort of make a decision about this. She decides not to marry him. And in the end, she ends up reuniting with Rochester after a series of events that we can talk about. And they end up getting married, at the end of the novel. So, yeah, hopefully that was a brief enough recap.
That was perfect. Thank you so much. Yes. So my question is, because this is one of the most famous novels about love. It's one of those classics that is still read and a lot of times adapted for series or movies, things like that. It's still extremely popular. And if we say that this is a tale of love, does this book have a particular ideology of love, a particular definition of love that it wants to kind of pass on?
So yes, although I'm going to be a bit of a contrarian here and say that I don't think it's a book about love necessarily, although love does serve a purpose within the novel. I think that it's a story about a young woman who achieves and maintains personhood in the face of the opportunity, I don't know if I'd call it an opportunity, or the temptation is probably a better word, to subsume herself into this man that she loves. So what I would say is that if it has an ideology of love, which it probably does, it's really an ideology of two equals meeting, so that despite the sort of legal and social structures by which women were legally considered the property of their husbands. I mean, there had been some changes to marriage laws, but, generally speaking, women's identities were subsumed into their husbands. So within this structure, you have two people who meet as spiritual, emotional, intellectual equals. And so the ideology of love would be that like a woman isn't necessarily meant to be subservient to a man, that in fact, love is about the meeting of two well-matched individuals who respect each other equally, if that makes sense.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense, because it seemed to me that there is a kind of a contrast between this idea of love as madness, falling madly and deeply in love with someone, losing yourself, right?
Yeah.
And this idea of marriage as a kind of a market, almost like a transaction. I mean, as you said, there are these social structures, what marriages are supposed to be based on, and all that. So Jane kind of ends up somewhere in the middle. So yes, marriage, yes, love, yes, but there are conditions, there are terms and conditions that she has, and those are that she is accepted as she is. That somehow love is supposed to maybe give her a sense of a kind of selfhood, that she owns herself rather than is owned by someone. So this equality that you talk about, it's like being on equal terms in this relationship.
Right. I mean, so there's an added layer, I think, of complexity in that she's his employer, right? So, I guess in those terms, she doesn't quote unquote own herself because she's employed by him. But even within those constraints, I mean, she's still asserting her personhood in certain kinds of ways. But yeah, for Jane, marriage is not necessarily about a good social match, which is actually really a reasonable, in my opinion, it is a very reasonable sort of desire to have like if this is your main form of security, which things were changing by the mid-19th century, but if this is your main form of security, you want a husband who is has the financial means to take care of you and himself and his children. You want a husband who doesn't gamble his inheritance away or isn't debauched and drinking, and you want a husband who doesn't physically abuse you. Like, this is what I always tell my students, like, that's a good match. You know what I mean? Like, that's a good match. Who cares about love? Like, love is irrelevant when you are, it's like nowadays, if you love your job, that's lucky. You know what I mean? Like, good job that you found a job you love. And that's really how marriage was. But Jane is not seeing it in those terms. Or at least I think we can assume she doesn't see it in those terms when she decides to leave him. Although you could argue that she decides to leave him because he's already married, et cetera, et cetera. But there are other sort of things happening around their engagement that make it clear that she's not actually comfortable with the way things are going. Because as soon as they get engaged, he starts treating her as a little pet, and he starts buying her all these fine clothes that she doesn't want, and, dandling her on his knee and basically doing all these things that she's not particularly comfortable with because the power balance has now shifted and he's starting to act more like that domineering husband. So I think that within the structure of the novel, Bertha serves as an occasion for her to flee an engagement that, started out as two equals coming together, but was quickly turning into that, into that more typical power dynamic.
Indeed, that's really amazing, as you said, because when they first meet, there is a sense that they are a match. We get a sense they're kindred spirits, that they maybe complete each other, or they see something in each other that is very attractive. And he is ready to accept her as she is, and she falls in love with him. But then, as you say, immediately these structures start being visible, that he starts falling into these old habits of being a man. And what he thinks, maybe a marriage should be like. I really like the way you said this, that it's like you check these boxes, like, okay, he's not like this, he's not like that. Like you're kind of removing all the bad stuff, and then if enough good stuff is is left, then that's a good match. I really like that kind of almost. But as you say, she has much higher aspirations. That she still thinks that marriage becomes a part of the equation. Love becomes a part of the equation of marriage, so that she wants love to be a part of it, and not just ticking those boxes that most people would in her time. Is that realistic, or what?
Okay, so
Yeah,
I was talking about Jane as a governess and as a woman who wouldn't have had the same kind of expectations on or even for the marriage market than, say, other middling class women who had, a dowry or family connections, who could, someone who could sort of facilitate her entry into the marriage market, right? In part because she was this growing class of women who were called redundant women. There were women without marriage prospects, in part because all the, men were going off to the colonies to sort of earn their livings and would maybe come back or maybe not come back. But also as an orphan. So she ends up joining this class of women who are governesses, and that normally would have been her best hope, right? So the fact that she meets Rochester and they fall in love, and there is this possibility that they could get married, is really sort of like was out of her, I don't know. It wasn't really a possibility that she probably entertained to begin with, if that makes sense. So I think the thing that's interesting about Jane is, given this possibility and given the increase in sort of status and financial stability that she would have gotten from marrying Rochester, she ends up actually putting herself in a more financially precarious situation by leaving, right? By taking off and, heading across the moors, to get away from him. And actually, I don't think it's just that she's trying to get away from him. I think that she's trying to get away from the temptation of, either entering what would be essentially entering into an illicit or not really bigamist at this point, because they probably wouldn't have gotten married, but becoming his mistress, right?
Indeed. So in a sense, she wouldn't be an equal in that relationship in any way. So when she runs away, she is, in a sense, putting herself in this precarious position and in a different situation. But at the same time, she's not ready to compromise on herself. She's not ready to compromise, that selfhood that she believes in, who she's supposed to be, or who she believes herself to be. So she doesn't really want to hurl herself into. She obviously seems to think that's a worse situation than being lost, being without money, being in that kind of a situation. That's really interesting, isn't it? It's like that kind of basis that she wants to affirm who she is in a relationship as really, really essential.
Well, and I'm not even sure it's so much affirming who she is, but affirming that she has a right to personhood, right? Full personhood. Mm-hmm. And I mean, if you recall, when she's at Marsh End, she faces a similar sort of temptation with St. John Rivers, although it's different. So like with Rochester, it would have been this like passionate love match. Mm. And with St. John Rivers, it would have been this sort of like sacrificing herself to duty. You know what I mean? Like giving up on love and entering into marriage where she can be useful and be dutiful. So you kind of have two different models of marriage that she has to sort of choose between. And in the end, she chooses neither of them. But because of the circumstances of Rochester getting wounded when he goes to save Bertha, like she doesn't have to, she ends up getting marriage on her terms, if that makes sense. And I think it's important that he gets wounded, by going in and trying to save Bertha because, he sees her as a burden. He sees her as a mistake. I think it's important that he married Bertha partially from pressure from his brother and his father, but partially because she was beautiful and rich and well-connected. And so it was like all these sort of marriage market ideals, which did not work out, which did not turn out well for him. But he still goes to try to save her, even though letting her die would have been the more convenient thing. But in the end, his getting wounded, losing his eye, losing his hand, and Jane getting an inheritance, ends up making them equals, physically, now they're physically equal, and now they're equal in terms of wealth and riches.
Okay, so I'm really curious about the way Bronte seems to structure this novel. It seems to me that she gives us a full inventory of all things concerning marriage, love, the time they live in, and all these things. So in order for Jane to reach this sense of equality in marriage, and in fact in any kind of relationship. I mean, from the time that she was a child, we remember that her aunt told her she's unlovable, for instance,
right?
And that she has bad blood. So that's something that she's kind of inherently unlovable, and yet from that time, she has this personality where she believes that she has the right to be loved. And that's something for me that kind of remains throughout her whole life. I mean, she already knows it as a child. Yes, I am lovable. Yeah, you should love me. And when she meets Rochester, she kind of continues in the same way. She wants to be on equal terms. She wants to be loved, and she thinks she has the right to it, and she has the right for an equal marriage and all these things. So if you care to comment on that.
Yeah, so I don't actually know if I would describe it as her thinking she has a right to be loved, right? I think that I think a part of what she's doing, I think part of her journey or her, whatever you want to call it, it's like a Bildungsroman, which I probably said really badly because that's a German word. But anyway, so it's this sort of tale of her coming of age and learning, sort of coming up against social pressures, which are represented by her aunt and, Rochester's sort of like desire to marry her, which turns out to, he wants to continue that relationship even after it becomes clear that legally they can't. And then St. John Rivers, right? So I don't necessarily know that she thinks she has a right to be loved, because as she and Rochester are developing this relationship, she seems to think like, there's no way. I'm little and poor and plain. I don't have any of the characteristics that one would normally want. And yet she still has this really strong inherent desire, or this drive, to be able to live her life and to be, as I said, fully human. So I kind of feel like love is, in this novel, love is a way for Bronte to sort of comment on social structures, to comment on the way women are supposed to sort of subsume themselves into the domestic roles, whether it's as a governess or a wife. And I think part of the message of the novel is that, like, love between equals, relationships between equals, if they're male and female, the current social structures do not support that. Right? So whether or not you think about it in terms of like, I deserve to be loved, which I think is a very 21st century kind of thing. It's like, I deserve to be, right? I deserve to be. And I remember I read this novel when I was really young and fell in love with it, and had this amazing Romanticism professor who taught it. And one of the things she sort of explained was, you have the male romantic poets who are off traipsing up mountains, the Alps or mountains in Wales, right? They're like having these encounters with the sublime and, feeling the full, like sort of the fullness of their creative imagination. And part of what Jane Eyre is doing is doing that within her own limited context, right? So she's walking back and forth across the top of, Thornfield, and she's having all these emotions, and she's sort of having, these richness, this richness of experience, internal experience. And I just remember this professor saying that, like, for women in that period, the sublime had to be projected onto a man because of the limitations of their life, right? But what I think is important about Jane Eyre, and I mean, I know people disagree with me, like but like, I do think that in the end, they end up being equalized, right? They end up being, like I had a student say to me, well, she still has to take care of him. Now he's blind and has, and it's just like, yeah, but that's not what the novel is. You know what I mean? Like, the novel itself is not saying that. Like, we can say that looking back, but really what the novel is saying is that he cannot lord over her anymore, and he cannot keep her trapped because of financial, stability, so that she gets to be fully woman or fully human within the context of this relationship. I think I'll stop there. I have other things I could say, but I don't know if I actually totally agree with myself on some of these points. So,
but I'm absolutely agreeing with you, because by the end of the novel, however, some of the things that happen seem to me kind of unrealistic, maybe, or this kind of. Or theoretically, that there is a certain theory of marriage, love, and all those things, personhood, which Bronte kind of puts throughout this story to kind of show it. It seems to me there is an abstraction on what she wants, not and by the end of the novel, I really believe that this is true love. And that's the thing for me, that there are so many things throughout which could make me doubt whether or not Jane loves Rochester for real, or he loves her, and all these things. There's so many things in the social structures of her time that could make me doubt. But by the end, now that Bronte has taken both of them, all of them, through a series of kind of cleansing rituals, in the end, I kind of firmly believe they are equal. I believe that they are in love, that this is a good marriage, that this is a happy marriage, or that it will be a happy marriage. So I don't know. This is the kind of almost like a philosophical experiment of sorts, or a social experiment, in which just a number of things are thrown at these characters. They go through all of them. As you said, it's a Bildungsroman. And the result is something that I can trust.
I agree. I agree. Because if you want to think about it in terms of, like, well, is she only going to marry him for his money, etc., which I think we're given enough sort of clues throughout that that's not Jane's character. However, at the end, she's got her own money, so she doesn't need him. She's got this wonderful sort of homosocial group of cousins that she could stay with and live happily. This little group of women, like intellectuals and artists. And he is now physically maimed, right? But she still goes back to him. I mean, it's not like she still goes back to him. Like, obviously, so for him, loving this plain woman, and her loving this man who is, I think you mentioned at one point, is handsome, but is now disfigured. I think it's really sort of saying that in order for some sort of true emotional, spiritual, like whatever abstract words you want to use, or to exist, it has to be outside of the sort of typical trappings that we think should surround love. And I think that even holds true today to some extent, in that, like, we might not worry about his money as much as we used to in the Western world, but certainly things like looks factor in as if that somehow is important. You know what I mean? Yeah.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely, and that's the idea for me. Is that as we know, Bertha used to be really beautiful, and there are a lot of beautiful women around Rochester, and so there's the beauty. There's a lot of these things that could be these cliches of attraction, and Bronte kind of removes them one by one, trying to get at the very core of it. Okay, what is it that makes kind of two people match? What is the character, the equality, this respect of each other's character, or as you said, the respect that they are.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and I think, like, so Rochester is just, I think, a very classic Byronic hero in that he's dark and brooding and, you know what I mean? Like handsome, but kind of devilish in his way. But so is Jane, right? I mean, she's not really handsome, but she's, she has her own brooding. She has her own passions. Like she is also a Byronic hero. And I use the word hero deliberately. And so, yeah, like and so I think the other part of it is, can the Byronic hero make room? Like, can there be two protagonists in a marriage, for example? Right?
Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah. And I think that in the end, for Rochester, the answer is yes. But as you mentioned, I think you mentioned it, like when they get engaged, he starts falling back into like old, sort of typical patterns of male, of the way a man might treat his love interest, right? In an infantile, I'll just say he's treating her in an infantile way, since I can't get that word out. You know what I mean? Yeah.
Well, definitely. So Bronte wanted to remove that as well. I mean, she's really kind of pointing out things which she thinks are negative, which are really corrupting this idea of what kind of this purity is, the pure ideal of. Although I really like this idea of Jane being a Byronic hero and the two Byronic protagonists kind of being matched. This kind of brings me just a little bit to Gilbert and Goubard's famous reading of the novel, and Bertha as this mad woman in the attic, and this kind of difference between Jane as someone who is in control, who has a strong kind of rational. So she's not succumbing to this wild love. She's not burning with love. She's not mad with love. Whereas Bertha, I mean, as this mad woman, she's outside herself. She is she's supposed to be crazy, and therefore her love cannot be trusted if she even loves you. We don't know. There's a lot of mystery shrouded.
Right.
All that is yeah.
Yeah. So I refreshed myself on the Gilbert and Goubard essay in Mad Woman in the Attic, because I haven't read it since I was an undergrad, and I love it. I mean, it's still one of my favorite readings of this novel. And one of the things I like is the way Bertha functions as the double for Jane. Mm-hmm. So, I don't know how far I would agree with this, but it's certainly compelling when they say, when Gilbert and Goubard say that, like, when Bertha comes in and like rips apart the wedding veil, that's sort of Jane's desire to rip apart the wedding veil, because there's all this language around how she looks at herself in the mirror and she feels alien, and there's all these clothes that don't really match her. So there's a way in which the two part, like Jane and Bertha together, make a whole sort of unit. And I don't want to say person, but like unit. Yeah. And I mean,
is it a part of their argument that this side of sort of needs to be sacrificed? That the Bertha character, or that side of Jane maybe needs to be sacrificed for this relationship, for this ideology of love and marriage to actually be established? Isn't that a part of their argument? And what do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. So I'm trying to remember. I mean, they say something along the lines of like, Jane has to sort of, so, you have Miss Temple, who represses everything. She's at Lowood School, who represses everything to be, an angel in the house, a proper woman, even though you can see that there's some discontent, underneath. Jane somehow learns to sort of like keep the Bertha part under wraps or controlled. And so they argue that like when Bertha dies in the end, that's the symbolic death of her sort of like child self. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. I have to go in a different direction, which is part of me is just like, well, it's not, Bertha's from the West Indies, right? She's Creole. Yes. And she just sort of gets sacrificed to be this like double for Jane. You know what I mean? Yeah. And we don't know if she loves him or why she married him. We know he married her. We know Rochester married Bertha for the wrong kinds of, not for love, right? For status, etc. We have no idea what was going on in the other end. And Jean Rhys actually writes about that in the White Sargasso Sea. She narrativizes Bertha's side of the story. So, I mean, I think the way Gilbert and Gubar look at it is sort of like, how does a woman character reconcile the fact that if she's too passionate, society will deem her mad, right? If she's too much, society will deem her masculine. And they also make this interesting argument that like Bertha's big, right? She's described as being big and tall. And so she in a way, she's a physical match for Rochester and for men, right? Because she, I think, stabs her brother. You know what I mean? So this is the thing. Like the novel, I love the novel. I love the way it ends. It appeals to my sort of like, oh, everybody's happy in the end, and in a way that I can get behind. And yet, Jane still sort of has to, she can't be too much, if that makes sense.
Indeed, definitely. So there is a sense that she's constantly negotiating a number of features. So going to any extreme, even the way you described, for instance, the two different kinds of marriages, like the one that she could have with Rochester and that she could have with
St. John.
What's his name? St. John. Yes. So they are very kind of. They are established forms of marriage. They are quite different, but she's kind of negotiating, saying, okay, what is this third kind that I really want? What is the third kind that will allow me to be? Because in either of these, I'm not going to be
right
myself. So there's a number of these kind of extremities or these ways which the story can go, and she is looking around, she is experiencing them and saying, okay, well, where do I find myself in all this in the end?
Yeah. But I mean she's negotiating social structures as we all are always. Mm-hmm. I mean, even Rochester's negotiating them too. It's just a little bit easier for him because, he's accorded more respect, or you know what I mean, like personhood. Like essentially life is a lot easier for, rich landed males in the 19th century. Yes. But it doesn't mean that he too is actually turning his back on what would be considered a more appropriate match when he decides not to pursue Blanche Ingram, which I don't think he was ever really seriously considering her. Again, this is like this sort of a cruel, twisted thing that he tests Jane by like flaunting this, other potential in front of her. But Jane rises to the occasion and is just like, cut it out.
Yes.
You think like I don't have feelings? Like, what are you doing? So, and I think that's the turning point for them. Yeah.
Yes. Absolutely. There is another thing which I want to ask you, might be interesting to consider in this story. And so you see, as a part of my podcast, I'm kind of basing it on this idea that comes from Geoffrey Eugenides, the Greek-American author. So he speaks of Catullus, the Latin poet, and he talks about this couple, so Catullus loves Lesbia, but she loves a sparrow. She has this sparrow. She's madly in love with the sparrow, and Catullus wants the sparrow dead. He wants it gone because it kind of stands between him and the object of his desire. But when the sparrow dies, what happens is that she's so sad that now love is completely impossible. Now, that thing which he thought was an impediment or an obstacle is gone, but now she cannot even consider love. So Eugenides thinks that most kind of love stories have this sparrow, this kind of thing which makes love difficult but also worthwhile. So this may be a little bit of a kind of tough question when it comes to Jane Eyre. Do you feel there is a sparrow in this story? And what could it be?
Okay, so yeah, I do actually have an answer for that. So first of all, Catullus is nuts, because if he thinks that the only thing between him and Lesbia is the sparrow, he's clearly not considering Lesbia, right? Like,
yes.
Removing the object of her affections is not going to make her, it's not going to make anyone just be like, oh, now I love you, right? So that seems to me that this total disregard of the quote unquote object of love, you know what I mean? Like,
yes, absolutely. Exactly.
Like, it's nuts. And yet I think it's a very pervasive sort of thought process. Yeah. And I'll be slightly sexist, maybe amongst men, you know what I mean? Or at least we'll put it in the past, the olden men. But so the sparrow, so I do think, I don't know if there's an exact equivalent of the sparrow, right? Unless it's Jane's own integrity and sense of self, which she will not compromise, right? So again, like, she gets increasingly uncomfortable about the way the relationship is starting to look once it starts to assume the trappings of social propriety, right? The engagement and the marriage. And fortunately, there's a Bertha who stops things, right? So maybe the sparrow is Jane's sense of self or respect for herself that Rochester has to sort of come to realize, like, no, she's not just this little pet that I can like sit on my lap and dress up and act like she's a doll. She's another human being. And this is why I was attracted to her in the first place. So maybe that's the sparrow.
Oh, you know what? I'm loving your answer so much. It makes me giddy. I have to say,
that's awesome.
Seriously, this is an amazing answer. It really resonates with the way I've been looking at this novel and teaching it for years. It's just so perfect because I've been constantly thinking, like, is it an object or is it a feature? Is it what is it that could be this sparrow here? And you describe it so perfectly, especially in relation to Catullus, who is really, as you say, not considering Lesbia at all. He's just imagining that this is a thing between us. And if I just remove it, but really not asking her, the object of his desire remains an object rather than a subject.
Absolutely. And I think like one could potentially trace this throughout, love poetry, from Shakespeare to Donne, like this whole notion that like this woman is just sort of like an occasion to project one's love onto or into, with no sense of like, well, there's actually like, there's a whole other being here who might be in love with a sparrow.
Who might be in love, exactly.
Yeah.
Yes. And what it means that you can actually love more than
yeah.
This is absolutely stunning. I'm loving it so much. To wrap up, I just wanted you to consider one thing, because you have mentioned a little bit like, the history and at some point when I was saying something about love, you said, well, that's kind of very 21st century. And since this novel is so popular, still very popular, so I'm thinking, in our present time, what is love? What do we think love is? For instance, we would say that the idea that if we marry, there should be love. If love disappears, then marriage should stop, in a sense. That might be a kind of an idea that we have today. So I'm thinking like, where do we learn what love is? And if we look at our kind of Western education, where did I learn what love was? So let's say I learned it from Jane Eyre, and it developed, from that time, that I'm thinking that maybe Jane Eyre is one of those great works which established some grounds for what we now today still think love is, or how marriage should work, how we should look at ourselves, and so on. So I don't know if you could reflect a little bit on that.
I mean, possibly. I mean, so I think that what is love is it's a process question. You know what I mean? Like, I think what I thought love was when I was 14, 18, 25, I'm not gonna say how old I am now, but like, you know what I mean? Like it changed. And even my reading of Jane Eyre has changed. Like before I was just like head over heels in love with Rochester because I was 18 years old. You know what I mean? Mm. And it took a little bit of sort of time and maturity to be like, wait, he's kind of a jerk. And then I could shift my focus more to Jane and to look at her integrity. So I think that with the right kind of instruction, yes, that this could be a novel that could be a model for what love could be. You know what I mean? Because I think we learn it from a lot of sources. I think we learn it from our parents. I think we learn it from our movies that we watch. There's narratives like, I mean, I don't even get me started, but like I recently reread Shulamit Firestone's chapter on marriage and the dialectic of sex. And it blows my mind how wonderful it is, because basically what she says, I'll say this really quickly. You used to have the marriage market. The marriage market went away. We had to figure out a way to trick women into still wanting to get married. So we invented love.
Oh, wow. All right.
You know what I mean? And I just find
Yes.
I find that compelling in so many ways. And yet, like, I'm not so cold-hearted as to like, as to wish that, to hope that isn't entirely true. But yeah, I mean, and then there's all different kinds of love, right? There's like, oh, I'm in love with you because you're so attractive and all these things. And then there's like, I love you, and so I'm going to take care of you in your illness, or, I'm not going to like divorce you or leave you because now you have no hand and you're blind, which is Jane Eyre.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, I think that's a very big question.
It is a big question, and I think by looking at Jane Eyre properly and really analyzing it deeply, we can see there's a lot of traces of the things that we inherited and that we kind of still negotiate in our own lives. As you say, we get the idea of love from so many different sources, and how we kind of approach love, as you said, in different periods of our lives, depending on what stories are appealing to us, how we see or place ourselves in those stories,
right?
The way we tell our own stories to others, all those things are so fascinating, and this is one of the reasons I love this novel, is exactly because with a lot of passion and a lot of patience, if you analyze it, if you look into it, you can learn quite a lot. It's so complex. Jane goes through so many things that all of us could go through or have gone through, and we can learn from that. So I find this extremely fascinating.
I agree. And actually, I've never. Well, I guess I have thought of it in the ways we've discussed, but it never really fully came together to me that one could teach this novel as one model of relationship, that is, one might say, a feminist version of a relationship or a human version of a relationship. You know what I mean? One that values both partners' fullness of being equally.
Yes.
I think it's even more rich and interesting because of the social context of its period, right? So like understanding it in those terms, I think, is what helps us be able to port some of the concepts into our own terms.
Oh yes, definitely. And that's something I like to engage with in my classes with my students, and make them compare and think and rethink, and the things they take for granted, for instance, when it comes to love and relationships, and especially when they think that they have a clear idea what love is, but really never considered where that idea comes from.
Right. Right.
And I think that's something that I think Jane Eyre can be used to teach, for people to kind of reflect, where does it come from and how do I negotiate it? What do I sacrifice and what do I gain in the process?
Right. Right. And I mean, I think part of the reason it can be still so popular of a novel is because it is offering a vision of love or a model of love that really is legible in the 21st century. I mean, if we go back to Pamela by Samuel Richardson, I mean, my students are always completely grossed out by the fact that like she marries him in the end. You know what I mean? And so that's not as legible as I think Jane Eyre continues to be, which I think is interesting. And I mean, I agree with you. I mean, one of the things I love to do in my classes is to really like breaking the students of their habits of trying to project things backwards. So like the further back in the 18th century you go, the more those gender binaries don't hold in the same way that they do in the Victorian period. But I think that this particular novel is modern enough that, it can teach a good model of relationship.
Oh, I absolutely agree with that. It's that's why it's so remarkable. I like this idea of legibility and the transfer over time.
Yeah.
Lisa Ann, this was a huge pleasure for me to talk about Jane Eyre with you. This was really amazing, and I hope our viewers, our listeners, will enjoy it as much as I did. So I want to thank you so much for this opportunity to talk about one of my favorite books.
Well, thank you, because it's a rare chance to actually get to speak as excitedly and nerdily about, the literature that I'm really, really into. Most people don't have as much tolerance for it as you do. So yeah, thank you for a really fun conversation. And
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely, and anytime. And I hope we'll meet again in one of these episodes when we take on another book that we love and speak as proper nerds, as you say.
Yeah.
Really.
Well, you should hear me on Pride and Prejudice.
Oh. Absolutely. Okay, let's.
Which is another one of those like novels that are just hugely popular in the 21st century. So
yes, absolutely. And as someone who wrote his BA on all the novels by Jane Austen, I was quite ambitious back then. I'm really looking forward to that. And I love Jane Austen. I still have all the books with all my notes from that time.
Yeah, I actually pulled out my very first copy of Jane Eyre with my notes in it.
Oh, wonderful.
Just to be sure I had everything at my fingertips. So, yeah. Well, thank you so much. I really enjoyed this.